Alright, so this story is inspired by the fact that it's 2012 and the apocalypse should be coming any day now. Except for the fact that on CNN there was recently a headline that said NASA astronomers debunk the 2012 myth, so your tax dollars at work. This story is called A Pale Horse. When pestilence rode into town, we weren't surprised, seeing as how war and famine had already been through and taken the teenagers and the cattle. Still, we turned out in our dozens to watch the horsemen arrive, a swirling dot on the two-lane highway. The ashen horse's hooves struck through the asphalt, straight down to the red clay beneath, and the scrubby wildflowers on the side of the highway withered in its fly-ridden wake. My mother started muttering about Lady Bird Johnson and how she'd be rolling in her grave if she could see this. Father Ackley tried to shush her and broke out the communion wine like somebody in action movie montage. And I was just happy that at least the horse wasn't leaving puddles of blood in its wake like war had. He took away the only swimming hole in town by turning Stark's pond into blood, and then famine dried it up entirely. The edges of the rider bled pale green and black under the hard blue canvas of sky, and as pestilence came closer, it congealed into a visible form. A skeleton covered in skin, mouth and eyes full of flies in their thousands, lank blonde hair falling out to lie like pale serpents across her black leather jacket, white t-shirt, Levi's worn nearly white. "Somebody's a Brando fan," Mr. Dryden said, as pestilence rode her horse through the parting crowd and down Main Street to the town square. Miss Jones saw her box of petunias by the courthouse crumble as pestilence passed by, and dissolved into tears on Father Ackley's shoulder. I ducked out from beneath my mom's hand and met up with Bobby on the edge of the crowd. "Let's follow her," said Bobby. I didn't really want to, since the last thing I'd heard my older brother say before he fell into step behind war on his blood-red horse was, "I have to follow him." But Heiko was a tiny town, and if the other kids thought you were a coward, then you were just doomed for life, or until you went to college, which, when you were 10, seemed like the same thing anyway. Bobby yanked me down the street towards the courthouse, past the Coffee Cup Cafe and the Billy the Kid Museum, and we ducked behind the columns outside the back entrance. The horse stood on the pristine lawn that wasn't so pristine anymore, cropping the grass and swishing its tail to shoo away the flies that followed its rider. Pestilence herself sprawled out on the steps, her booted feet kicked up on the banister. A battered cowboy hat she'd swiped off the wooden Billy the Kid statue outside the museum and tilted low on her head. Her face, now that I could see the skin stretched tight as a drum across her skull, looked like a saddlebag with eyes. "Look!" Bobby hissed, stabbing a finger at her and nearly toppling out from behind the column. "She's got the newspaper." True. The force of religious terror and disease held the newspaper propped on her bony knees and perused the sports section with fly-ridden eye sockets, then crumpled it up and threw it over one shoulder into the trash can without looking. God knew why she read it. It had been nearly a month since the horseman started writing, and we hadn't had a new paper since. My dad tried to get to the next town over and found that all communication devices stopped working when the horseman came. He'd come back and told us that the horseman possessed, quote, quantum powers, and appeared simultaneously in every town, no matter where it was. The end of the world would all come at once, so there was no point in trying to drive anywhere else, because no matter where you went, the horsemen were there, waiting. I suppose you could take comfort in the fact that the end, when it came, would leave no one behind. Still, it may have been the end of the world, but for the most part, life went on as normal. There wasn't any school on account of the horsemen, so Bobby and I spent our days climbing trees and carrying water in buckets from the well in Bobby's backyard in some sort of purgatorial summer vacation. Every Sunday, we had to go sit in church with the rest of the town for the entire day and listen to Father Ackley and all the adults argue about why the end of the world wasn't happening the way Revelation said it would. I tended to fall asleep when old Timothy, who lived in a fallout shelter outside town and wished the Cold War never ended, started screeching about how barcodes were the mark of the beast. My father said our ability to hold endless meetings about the proper procedure for the end of the world illustrated either that bureaucracy had finally won, or the triumph of the human spirit. The day after pestilence came, old Timothy tried to shoot her. Bobby and I were on the roof of the Coffee Cup Cafe when Timothy came marching down Main Street with an old Remington rifle slung over his shoulder. Father Ackley hurried after him, yelling about what happened to the JROTC teacher, who tried to shoot more when he'd taken the high schoolers off and gotten his neck broken in one hit for his trouble. Old Timothy, who'd given up listening to anybody but himself when his idle, long-legged, betrayed the capital C cause, by having a summit in D.C. with Gorbachev, shot him the finger, and took up a position beneath the oak tree across from the courthouse steps. "He's not really going to do it," said Bobby, wide-eyed. "I don't know," I said, watching old Timothy lift his rifle and sight down the barrel. "He looks pretty determined." I grabbed my Girl Scout binoculars, stuck one side against my left eye and the other against Bobby's right, and we both peered down the street at old Timothy, who slid down onto one knee and braced the stock against his bony shoulder. We would have kept talking, except old Timothy yanked the trigger and fired. The bullet hit Pestilence in the 10-gallon hat, whipped it off her head, and thudded into the stone column behind her, sending shrapnel arrowing outwards and tearing into her leather jacket. Pestilence peered down at her jacket, raised a skeletal hand to touch her newly bare head, and jerked round on one booted heel to face Timothy. The sound of flies and locusts got louder, a roar like a mighty wind that set my one remaining baby tooth to rattling in my mouth. She shambled down the courthouse steps, stepped onto the lawn and left the grass blackening in her wake, and approached. Below, doors and windows slammed as people leaned out to see what Pestilence would do. Some of them, in all honesty, were probably rooting for her, since Timothy liked to flaunt the fact that he had a huge store of canned food laid aside for any apocalypse, nuclear or otherwise, while refusing to share it. A pretty stupid stance to take when it didn't seem like any of us were going to be around long enough to eat 50 canned whole chickens. Timothy shot again, but he might as well have been shooting at a glacier for all the good it did him. That shot buried itself in Pestilence's chest and stayed there. Pestilence was unperturbed. She halted before Timothy, who shrank back against the tree. His eyes started from his skull at my brother Stretch Armstrong when he squeezed too hard, and his gun, a futile shield, was clutched to his chest. She reached out, all of Heiko holding his breath, and settled one hand on his shoulder. Timothy quailed, his gaze glued to where she touched him. The roaring of insects grew louder. Pestilence lifted her hand, dropped it again, patted the man that had shot her on the shoulder, then went back to the steps, dusted off her torn hat, and plopped it on her head. Timothy slid down the tree and ended up flat on his back in the grass, gibbering. "She didn't kill him," said Bobby, pulling away from binoculars and frowning down the street. "What, just he tries to shoot her twice and he gets a gold star for effort instead of his head smushed?" I shrugged. "Maybe she didn't want to kill us. Maybe she's somebody who's really bad at her job but does it anyway. You know, like Paula Dean's shoving diabetes medication." I paused, struck by the glory of my own simile. Anyway, her cooking qualifies as a pestilence. Bobby rolled his eyes and swung off the roof to the ground. Philistine. The next morning, their father and the other adults found Timothy dead in his fallout shelter. His stomach bloated and his eyes yellowed. They buried him in the ground outside his shelter and stuck his gun atop the grave, and came back wondering how awful it was that the one person in town who had been looking forward to the apocalypse ended up being one of the first to crack. My mother said it was a textbook case of being careful what you wished for, and Pestilence said nothing when I and the other kids shouted from the safety of the oak tree to ask if she killed Timothy. Only smiled. That Sunday, Bobby and I sprawled on the floor beneath one of the tables at the back of the parish hall where the adults had their weekly argument. The other kids were across the hall, because they didn't like either Bobby or me. Me because I didn't eat meat and cried every time I went past the butcher's. And Bobby because he was skinny and didn't have a mom and wore hand-me-down clothes that stunk like cigarette smoke and cat pee. He'd only invited me to his house once, staring at his feet as he mumbled that we had him over so often and fed him so much that he might as well return the favor, and when I said, "Let's not," and say we did, he looked like he wanted to cry in gratitude. "Hey, Sam?" I looked up from the slot car track we were assembling and tilted my head in question. Bobby turned over one of the cars in his hands for a long moment, his face cast undersea greenish by the shadow of the table, and said, "What'd you do when your brother left?" I swallowed and rubbed one hand over my eyes to press back the swelling tears of the memory of Mike. He'd been a high schooler, might as well have been a god to me and Bobby. Taught us to make a fist the right way and punch anybody that said anything mean. Then war had come, and Mike had followed, and my mother had chased him all the way to the edge of town, shouting for him to come back, but he'd already been gone by then. He'd been gone the moment War and his red horse appeared on the horizon, his eyes hollowed out, and something else left behind. Something that breathed and lived, but that wasn't my brother. Well, I tried not to think about it, but I can't really not. His room is still there. I knew, because I slept in his bed, curled around his football helmet. And my mother hasn't been the same since. My voice cracked. I know he's gone, but it doesn't make it any easier. He took up so much space, you know? Bobby hitched himself a little closer and slung a gawky arm around my shoulders. I sniffled and wiped my hand on his jeans, and he let me, which is how you know you've got a true friend. I heard the other kids giggle and start whispering, but I didn't listen. The one good thing about the end of the world, it gave you the freedom not to care. Why'd you want to know? I said. Bobby avoided my eyes and rolled his car back and forth across the tile. Pestilence got my dad. Found him this morning. Oh. I'd seen Bobby's dad once, a jolly mountain of a man, his nose red with broken veins, and his eyes tiny and piggish. He'd scared me, and if I'd been Bobby, I would have stayed out of the house as much as I could too. I'm sorry. No, but see, Bobby said, I'm not. He drank too much, and he only ever cooked TV dinners, and he hadn't left the house in years. You're the only person I've told, because I don't think I'd want to leave the house, I don't think he'd want to leave the house even after he died. I'm probably better off without him, but then I feel like a bad person because he was my dad, even if he was terrible at it. I chewed on that for a moment. The way I see it, we're all going to the same place anyway. You're probably going to have to see him soon and eat Hungry Man extra large dinners for eternity. So, might as well enjoy freedom while you can. Bobby jabbed the companionable hip into my side, then let go of my neck and slithered around to stare out at the crowd of adults. I joined him. Father Ackley droned, "The horsemen, horse people," someone in the crowd said. All eyes turned to Miss Jones, the high school physics teacher. What? Father Ackley said. He looked shocked, like he'd been in the middle of some fire and brimstone sermon when Miss Jones leaped up and whipped off her clothes. Horsemen implies that they're all male, but Pestilence is a woman. Ergo, the gender-neutral proper term is horse people. Miss Jones planted her hands on her hips and jutted her chin out like a prize fighter daring someone to take a swing. Father Ackley started, then paused. Subsided into a long silence, staring fish-like at Miss Jones. Should we really be discussing the political correctness of the horse people? As Miss Jones drew herself up and ballooned out of the apocalypse? Well, said Miss Jones, rock steady as tears started to leak down her face. It's now or never. Bobby spent the night after his father's death in Mike's room with me, and the night after that, and the night after that. Until finally my mother started setting out another place at the dinner table as a matter of course. She never asked why he didn't go home. I think even then she knew. Pestilence became a mascot of sorts, a friendly harbinger of our own apocalypse. Her hunched and fly-wooden figure could be spotted almost anywhere in town, shambling down Main Street to sit amongst the early morning crowd at the Coffee Cup Cafe, on front stoops watching kids play pickup football, a shadow in the stained glass of the parish hall. Her presence became a comfort, a tangible reminder of the fact that none of us would die alone. My birthday came a month after Pestilence did. We celebrated in the line dancing club / bar that was the only business in town whose take had increased since the horsemen started riding. I had a chocolate cake, and my father gave me and Bobby beers and glared at anybody who looked at us twice. The three-piece band struck up something twangy and we all got to dancing, fiddling while Rome burned. A shadow fell across the door. Pestilence slid into the maelstrom of people, stepped her way across the floor to the music and left images of the Black Plague etched into the wood in her wake. We kept dancing, determined to wring all the goodness we could out of our remaining days. Dizzy, drunk, I whirled my way out of Bobby's grip and into my mother's arms. I blinked up at her, grinned, and closed my eyes. She pressed her lips to my hair, held me close, and in the neon-drunk glow of the bar, my mother lied. It's going to be all right. Sam, my grandmother called, interrupting me where Bobby and I crouched in the front yard poking an anthill with a stick. I have a feeling something's coming. Sure, Granny. Granny always thought things were coming. Had even before the horsemen started riding through every town. And most of the time she'd been wrong. But I couldn't tell her no when she started spreading sacred salt, bought for $19.99 a pound off the cable channels, across the courtyard and hanging quote-unquote Native American healing crystals from the ceiling fans, because my mom would chew me out for hurting Granny's feelings. Standing, I stared to the east where purple twilight spread across the sky. Street lamps glittered like fireflies, marching row by row until they dissolved into a point on the horizon, a point where something gleamed. Couldn't quite make it out, though. It shone starlight, too bright to get a fix. So I ran inside to get my binoculars and leaped on the front porch railing to get a better look. A pale horse staggered, head hung low, towards the town, and his hunched and faceless rider bore a sword with the point touching the ground. Where the point touched, darkness spread out in a thin line along the horizon, climbed up and up and up, swallowing the stars, and as the horse passed the first set of street lamps on its way, they blinked out and left half the sky in shadow. The next pair went, and then the next, pulled into the absolute emptiness, all mankind's works undone. Sam, do you see something? Sam! I put down my binoculars with shaking hands and crouched beside Bobby. Across the street, the neighbors had come out and were staring into the eastern blackness. It's the last horseman, Granny, I said. Porches filled with people. Seemed the whole town was out there staring straight into the end without flinching. The last protest we could make against the certainty of the horseman. Granny harumphed and kept rocking, and the lights kept going out. I clenched my eyes shut as hard as I could and grabbed Bobby's hand. He squeezed back, his hand gross and sweaty against mine, and I blurted, Bobby, when you stuck that tarantula down Angie's dress in first grade, that was me that snitched on you. Sam, I stole your veterinarian Barbie last month and lit it on fire. I gaped and would have puffed him across the mouth, but didn't, because this was the time for going out forgiven. And the terrible, awful thing was that now, when the time was here for all to be revealed, there was no time. Don't worry, Granny said. This is a good end. I didn't know if it was or not, but we didn't have a choice. All we could do was crouch or stand there, eyes closed or open, and wait for the horseman to come and turn off the lights.